Okay, let's get started. I'm going to make sense, well, hopefully we'll get to this. I'm going to make sense of all this in a few moments. We left off because my first class and my second class are about, I don't remember, 30 or 40 lines apart. We left off where in Dream of the Rood? The last page. I've got a sticky note sticking at around line 95. Is that about where we were? Line 95? Or were we a lot further than that?
We were almost like 140. No, really? Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. So that's for my second class. Line 140. Yeah.
If I recall correctly, you said we would get to the last 10 lines next class.
Right.
I have a note here. So we're on May the Lord be my friend, you, etc., etc.
Line 144. Okay. Let's pick up there, and then I'm going to talk about this stuff and this stuff briefly. Okay. This is just in case you're curious, because I mentioned there's 1, 2, I think I mentioned there's 7, whatever. If you want me to, I'll talk about those briefly. So, if you remember, we said the entire poem is divided into 3 parts, right? So you've got the prologue, where the dreamer talks about, I was dreaming, and then you have this big long section where the cross speaks, okay? And then the cross stops speaking, and we come back to the dreamer, and the dreamer finishes it. When the cross speaks, that is also divided into 3 sections, okay? The cross relates history. I remember when I was raised as a tree, etc. Crucified Christ, blah, blah, ends all that. And then the cross begins that section that says, now, where he's talking about, or it is talking about, now, all the people, all Christians on the world look to me for, help, salvation, etc., etc. Then the cross looks to the future. So past, present, future. In looking to the future, the cross gives a charge, gives a command to the dreamer. Now I bid you, my beloved hero, reveal this vision. Okay? So, you've been given this information, go take it out and spread it around. Okay? Cross finishes, then we come back to the dreamer. So the cross is not going to speak anymore from that point on. Okay? And the dreamer goes on to tell us what about him that we talked about the other day that is similar to the other 2 poems we've read. Wanderer and Seafarer, not Cadman's Hymn. He's alone. Okay? We don't know why he's alone. He says all of his friends have gone forth. That's a euphemism. They're dead. So, like the wanderer, it's like this guy's the last survivor. Okay? The reason I use that term is because there is a portion of Beowulf that is called the Lay of the Last Survivor, the Song of the Last Survivor. And every time I teach this course, it strikes me that there is this recurrent theme in literature, okay? Not just in English literature. It's there in biblical literature of the person who's the last one to survive goes off and tells his or her story, and it goes all the way up through American literature, at least American literature of the 19th century. Call me Ishmael, beginning of Moby Dick. Ishmael is the last surviving member of the Pequod. Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, last surviving speaker. Last of the Mohicans, okay? He's the last. It just resonates. Why? There's got to be something deep in our human consciousness, collective, if you want to go all Jungian. So, I'm going to back up just a minute. So he says, the speaker says, he's going to experience line 140. Joy in heaven, where the Lord's host is seated at the feast, with ceaseless bliss. Wedding, supper of the Lamb, book of Revelation, and such. And then set me where I may afterwards dwell in glory, have a share of joy fully with the saints. May the Lord be my friend, he who here on earth once suffered on the hanging tree, the cross, for human sin. He ransomed us, gave us life, a heavenly home. Hope was renewed with cheer and bliss for those who were burning there. Now that seems like there's a big break in terms of ideas. Almost like there's something missing between hope and bliss in heaven but there was great burning there. What's that refer to? Where, Christian theology, is there great burning? Hell, okay? Hell. The Son was successful in that journey. We've not been told what that journey is. Mighty and victorious when he came with a multitude, a great host of souls into God's kingdom. The one ruler almighty, the angels rejoicing, and all the saints already in heaven, dwelling in glory, when Almighty God, their ruler, returned to his rightful home. The in hell, I had it written right up here the other day. This is called the harrowing of hell. Okay? If one accepts the traditional Christian story, where was, I'm trying to think how to put this. Where was Jesus when his body was in the grave? Notice my distinction. Assuming Jesus isn't his body.
Oh, so that like he went down the hill.
He was defeating death.
In a version of the creed, okay, this is the portion of the Nicene-Constantinopolitan big word, creed, that comes from the First Ecumenical Council. I didn't write down the rest of it because I ran out of board and my shoulder hurts so much. But in a version of the creed where it reads, incarnate of the Holy Spirit, the Virgin Mary became man, was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, suffered and was buried. There's another phrase. He descended into hell. And on the third day rose again. Okay? So just one little phrase. After buried, telling the believers what was going on when he was buried. That's called the harrowing of hell. There's all kinds of stories about it. Church fathers write about it quite a bit. Okay? Dante really goes into this in the Divine Comedy. If you've never read the Divine Comedy, do it. If I ever teach the European Lit to 1400 again, and you're around, take it because we do all of the Divine Comedy. Because when Virgil takes Dante to hell, and they get to the city of discord, chaos, etc., the walls are broken, the gates broken wide open. Okay, and there's a reason for that. Because of this, when Christ descended into hell, he overthrew the power of the devil. And there are fathers of the church who say, therefore, everyone who is in hell after the crucifixion, they're in hell not because of punishment. They're in hell because that's where they want to be. The doors, think of a maximum security prison with no doors on the cells, no gates, nothing. That's the implication, okay? So that's what he's talking about. And notice, the Son was successful in that journey, mighty and victorious. Exactly as you would expect what? Or of whom? God. And what did the earlier part of the poem I had it written over here, keep asserting. I had God, man. A warrior. That's exactly what you would expect your chieftain, your war leader to be. So even here, you get this portrayal of Christ as this Germanic war hero, war leader. All right? And notice, it's not just Christ by himself. He came with a multitude, a great host of souls into God's kingdom with the angels rejoicing. I don't think it's just that, the angels are sitting up there in the grandstands, clapping as he brings them into the heavenly stadium, so to speak. It's the angels are kind of coming with them. Okay? Who else is in the multitude? Souls from hell. What souls? Who? Popular modern Christianity says, you only go to heaven if you're a Christian. Before Jesus, how many Christians were there? Yeah, big old goose egg. Adam, Eve, all the patriarchs, etc., etc. Because hell, our modern word in the Old Testament refers not to place of burning, judgment, punishment, just Sheol. It's just where the dead go. And they're kind of like waiting. They're waiting for. And all those who go along, who are picked up, so to speak, from hell and taken up. All those who look forward to the coming. Okay? But again, Dante, as an example, not a church father, he's writing in the 14th century. And a lot of church fathers before Dante say, guess what? Not only, pre-Christian Hebrews, but a lot of non-Hebrew people would be there also. For example, Dante has, if I remember correctly, Plato, Socrates, no, not Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. He has a couple of very prominent pagans included in heaven for the simple reason they did the best they could with what they knew. They had the law of God written on their hearts and they followed that, etc., etc. Okay? So let me come back to all this for a minute. Now, I mentioned, in talking about the God-man part, or section, that there are a few scholars who think that the poet is referring to a couple of early major Christian heresies, okay? And that therefore he's ticking off, the way I put it the other day, fully God, fully man. Wanted to make sure everything's doctrinally pure. And that could be because the poet's proselytizing, the poet is correcting wrong belief, or it could be, I think I had written one day up here, or the poet is writing this kind of in anticipation or celebration of one of the 2 Sundays of the church year that your church celebrates the cross. One in September and one during Lent, okay? So that first word, heresy, that I dealt with was Arianism. Comes from a priest named Arius. Those are his dates. You don't have to know his dates. This part you do need to know, and this part you do need to know. Arius was a priest, and he was, in his words, trying to defend God's divinity when he said, the Son of God is not God. There was a time when the Son was not. He was begotten, okay? Which means, according to Arius' understanding, there was a time when he was unbegotten, okay? Which is why the Creed says, begotten of the Father before all ages, begotten, true light, the only begotten of the Father before all ages, true God, begotten, not made, one essence with the Father, etc., okay? Eternally begotten is what the First Ecumenical Council said. Always begotten, that is, he's always coming from the Father, okay? So that's Arianism. That was answered, so to speak, with this in the First Ecumenical Council. Pelagius, I be in my second class, so I'll mention it here. Pelagius was a British theologian. A little bit later than Arius, about 100 years later. Lived from 355 to 420. Pelagius taught that original sin, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, because that's a term that comes from St. Augustine of Hippo, right? Guy who wrote The City of God. Pelagius said, original sin does not affect human nature, or it doesn't taint human nature. And what he meant by that is, what is one of the key aspects of human nature? What does it mean? The fathers argued about all this kind of stuff. What does it mean to say, like Genesis says, man and woman, humanity is made in the image of God? But one of the first things they say is it means we have free will. We can choose what to do or what not to do. Okay? Augustine said that free will became totally corrupted as a result of sin. Pelagius said, no, it didn't. Okay? Why is this important? Because if that will is totally, notice my terminology, totally corrupted, as opposed to corrupted, if that free will is totally corrupted, then nothing anyone does will ever be good enough. Because everything everyone does will always be tainted by sin. This is what leads John Calvin in the 1500s to come up with his doctrine of the total depravity of everybody. It doesn't mean we're all like pigs rooting around in the muck all the time. It just means every aspect of who we are is tainted or touched by sin. In other words, none of us can do anything 100% good. At all. Okay? So that comes from Augustine. Pelagius said, no, can't be. Okay? He said, humanity can achieve perfection. We can achieve God. We can become like God. We can ascend to heaven merely through our own human will. Okay? The problem with that is it denies almost all of this. If that's the case, then why does this exist? If we can do it all on our own, why do we need Jesus? In other words, okay? So, this was deemed, I've got it written over here somewhere, this council, third council of Ephesus, this was deemed heresy. Okay? Notice, he's British. Pelagianism had greater hold in the British Isles than it did had greater hold in the British Isles than it did pretty much anywhere else. It did pretty good other places. I mean, when you have to deal with it when you have to deal with an issue in one of these councils, that means there's a lot of hubbub going on, okay, that's got to be solved, right? So these are the two major quote-unquote heresies that some scholars of the Dream of the Rood believe the poet is attempting to address at least. Because notice again what the poet says in the big long section through the mouth of the cross. Christ did it all. And if you look to the cross, notice, not to yourself, you'll find the salvation you're seeking, so to speak. Okay? If you can't read that, I'll just read the first part. First part meaning down to here. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. Notice, that's like a given. That's why there's nothing else. Okay? And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten, begotten of the Father before all worlds, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, of one essence. That's that word I wrote down on the board the other day. Homoousios, Homoousias, the same substance is what that means, right? Arius said, no, it's homo e, and he added the letter I between those two O's. Similar to, right? One essence with the Father, by whom all things were made. By the way, this by whom all things were made doesn't refer to the Father, it refers to Christ, right? Who for us men, for our salvation, came down from heaven, was incarnate of the Holy Spirit. We're going to deal with him, the next ecumenical council. He's not addressed in the first part, other than that. And the Virgin Mary became man, was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, suffered and buried, third day rose, ascended into heaven, sits at the right hand of the Father. He shall come again, end of the poem. He shall come again with glory to judge the living and dead, whose kingdom shall have no end. Okay? Thus endeth, the reading of kind of the dream of the Rood. It does come across pretty didactic, right? And yet, even with its didacticism, this is one of the most popular of Old English poems. Well, among us, we have no idea if it was popular among Anglo-Saxon readers, because almost every Old English poem survives in only one copy. The difference, the exception to that, Cadman's Hymn. Cadman's Hymn, we have at least 6 different manuscript copies. And in that 6 different manuscript copies, I think there are 3 different dialects. That's telling us that's circulated. People were reading in Bede's death song. Song he composed on his deathbed, so to speak. Those are the only 2. Just about every other major Old English poem only survives in one copy. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of which I'll mention related to this in 3 major reasons. Another reason is the Viking invasions, because the Vikings raided and looted churches and monasteries. Monasteries are where books are being produced, okay? And what they couldn't take, they tended to burn, because they were dirty, rotten bastards. And then the other one, Henry VIII, who was the biggest, dirtiest, rottenest, bastardest of all of them. We'll talk about him, with the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536, where he had the monasteries destroyed, essentially. Which is why if you go to any old monastery, 95% of them, in England today, and it's a ruin, it's not because of the Vikings. It's because of Henry VIII. Like Lindisfarne, Holy Island. Been there once. It was once beautiful. Protestants ripped it apart. Take that back. Henry's goons. I won't label that to the Protestants. Okay. Real quickly, because this is going to come up again. This is going to come up later on when we get into somebody like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and then later on in some Renaissance stuff. So I'll talk about it very briefly. Augustine of Hippo, writing in early 5th century, 410 for something, somebody can Google them. Augustine of Hippo. What are his dates? 354 to 430. So he's contemporary, notice, with, where is he? With Pelagius. Augustine was arguing against both Arius and Pelagius in quite a bit of his writing. In Augustine's the one who came up with, and I literally mean that, came up with the idea of original sin. Okay? The doctrine, so to speak, of original sin, which from the time of Augustine forward to today is, in one sense, it's almost the bedrock of Catholic belief. Not as much Protestant today, definitely Calvinist. So if you're Presbyterian or Reformed or something like that, it's pretty much at the heart of that. Okay? And that idea, and he bases it upon a couple of texts from Scripture, which I don't have to memory. I used to, back when I had a memory. It's basically when Adam and Eve sin in the garden, that sin, I'm going to use an Aryan kind of term. It's similar to, notice it's not the same, it almost becomes genetic. That is, it changes the genetic fabric of humanity. So that when they have a child, that child is quote unquote born in sin. And that child has sin in it. And when that child reproduces, same thing. It gets passed on. Okay? Original sin is the sin of Adam and Eve. But that gets passed on to all of Adam and Eve's heirs. According to that, and the way Augustine described it, it became a legal doctrine. Not secular go to court of law, but legal, religious court of law, so to speak, with God as the high judge and jury and executioner, And what does this mean? You go before the court, you go before the judge, and we're all guilty. And because we're guilty, we deserve what? Think of flames. Hell. Okay? Literally hell. So for Augustine, the sin of Adam and Eve was entirely a judicial or juridical or legal matter. And what that means, as the idea develops in the church, Catholic Church, later or through the years, what that means is, well, a whole bunch of things that we don't have time to get into. But if you've broken the law, what do you have to do? Keep going. Pay the price. You got to pay the punishment, okay? And or restitution. But if you're the one guilty and you can't pay the restitution because you're flawed, then somebody else has to step into the balance, so to speak. Okay? That becomes Jesus. So the purpose of Jesus is to do what? To suffer the punishment of God. I mean, that's putting it kind of baldly, but that's pretty much it. He's the scapegoat. Use all the Old Testament imagery you want. Okay? So original sin introduced this legal concept. You sin, you got to pay the price, or somebody else pays it for you. Okay? In the Eastern Church, where, for example, Constantinople, because I've got it somewhere, mentioned, in the Eastern Church, that idea never took hold. At all. There was nothing ever called original sin. It was always ancestral sin, meaning the sin of the first ancestors, Adam and Eve. Okay, so that just sounds like semantics, right? I mean, we're just talking different terminology. A little bit. Here's the real kicker. The Eastern Church never thought of what Adam and Eve did as a legal infraction or a juridical infraction. They never saw it as introducing sin in kind of a biological, genetic way. See, one of the things that came out of Augustine was the idea that having sex is sinful. And that idea developed so that in the Middle Ages, you'll see when we get to Chaucer, in the Middle Ages, the church taught you have to get married. Why? We have to keep going on. You have to procreate. Okay? And in order for a marriage to be valid, you have to consummate it. You have to have sex. But don't enjoy it. I mean, you got all these, pleasure receptors in it and such. don't enjoy it, but do it. And you should have large families. I mean, Catholic families, right? The thing. But don't enjoy it. We're going to get to wife of Baptist. She's going to go, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, so she has 5 husbands. Had, not all at once. Not polyamorous, Okay? It's the reason why Jesus has the conversation with the woman at the well, who's had 5 husbands, and the one she's with now isn't her husband. She's like, oh my God. Oh, literally. Oh my God. Okay? So, you have to have sex because you have to procreate, but don't enjoy it because that's sinful. So, I would assume, okay, I'm just, being plain old simple male me here, you're going to enjoy it some, so that's a sin. But you're doing what you're you're screwed, right? In every which way. There's no way to get out of this problem, okay? Eastern Church never had that issue. Ancestral sin was never about sex at all. For Augustine, that's what it became. That could be because of Augustine's backstory. Read Augustine's Confession. The guy was a lecher before he became a Christian. I mean, pick your quote-unquote porn star. Couldn't hold a candle to Augustine. Pardon?
I love that for him.
Okay? And then he becomes, one of the greatest, saints of the Western Church and such. So, that's going to come up a little bit later. Not going to talk about those. If you want to ask me questions, we can. Everything else, okay, that's all done. It's faster than I expected. So, now,
What are the 2 words under ancestral sin?
Disease or illness.
disease, sorry, I didn't mention that. According to the Eastern Church, what Adam and Eve's sin does is it introduces an illness into humanity. Notice, not judicial guilt, an illness. So, if we're all sick, what do we need? Louder? Aid, healing, curing, medicine, a physician, God, the great physician. I mean, if he made us and now we're sick, he can remake us. We're going to read a holy sonnet, maybe, by John Donne, where he's going to say, remake me, make me new. David says in Psalm 50, create in me a new heart, O God. Okay? So, it's all about healing rather than paying the judgment, paying the fine. Okay? And so, you have an emphasis on this side on making someone whole again. And I think this is what is actually, even though Tolkien is Catholic, and Tolkien's very much on this side, I think this is what's in J.R.R. Tolkien's mind when he's writing The Lord of the Rings. Because he emphasizes that one character wants Gollum to be healed, to be cured before he dies. Why? Because Gollum's a dirty, rotten bastard. I mean, why would you want to... You don't get this in the films, because the films totally obliterates what Tolkien's really doing. Because Peter Jackson, while he's a great cinematographer, doesn't know squat about how to read a text. Okay, just don't even get me going. So that's what the disease illness is. So if we're diseased, we have to be made whole. By the way, Middle English, how many of you ever go Christmas caroling or have gone Christmas caroling? And you've sang or sung, here we go a wassail. Wassail? Okay, we think that's a drink, and it is. But the phrase comes from was, it's an ash also, wassail. Be whole is what that means. Be healthy. So when you go a wassailing, you're going around to other people trying to help them be whole, help them be complete. We're going to see that come up, that idea, come up in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Okay? Louder? Literally. Yep. Okay. So, Beowulf. And you've got, notice, a fairly long introduction to Beowulf. I can't remember if I actually put a link up. I will put a couple links up to some other Beowulf. I've got a bunch of Beowulf stuff up. I've got Beowulf geography and a pronunciation guide, and guide to the characters and feuds. You really need to look at that one. Okay? It doesn't list everybody in the poem, but it lists quite a few. And there's a lot of feuds going on in the poem. And by the way, let me just make this bald assertion right now. Feud, the idea of feud and what a feud is central to the poem. The reason I'm saying that, and it's really the main reason why I don't use it. The Norton Anthology of English Literature, last time I used it at least, the introduction to Beowulf said, feud is at the periphery of the poem. It's not central. What's central to the poem are Germanic customs, behaviors, blah, blah, and I'm like, no, totally wrong.
How is it not central when that's like half of what's going on in the poem?
It's a lot more than half, you'll see, okay? Which is why we're going to spend so much time on it, we're going to get so far behind, okay? So it's central. So, a couple of background things. Beowulf's preserved in what's called the Noel Codex. Noel because of the guy who owned it. Can't remember his first name. Lawrence, Laurence. Noel is the guy who owned it in the 16th century, right? Now it is called Cotton Vitellius A15. Why? Because the guy who owned it, after Noel, was named Robert Bruce Cotton. I'm sure he would be upset if I did not give his Sir Robert Bruce Cotton. He was an antiquities collector. He collected manuscripts. Okay? Whole bunch of them. Old and Middle English manuscripts. It's because of him that we have Beowulf today. It's because of him that we have Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, because there's only one copy of each of them. Okay? Again, Vikings, Henry VIII, and what was the third one I mentioned? I can't remember. It's estimated over 90% of the
fire.
Yeah, the fire, the cotton fire. It's estimated that about 90% of Old and Middle English literature was destroyed. And we only have thus maybe 10%. Okay? So in the Noel Codex, you have these 5 works. This isn't quite the exact order. Something in my mind is telling me the life of St. Christopher comes first. But you have the Wonders of the East, Letter of Alexander to Aristotle, Life of St. Christopher, Beowulf, and Judith. Okay? Now you would look at those, and some people have, many have, and say, why in the world would you put these 5 things in this? What does the Wonders of the East have to do with the life of St. Christopher? What does the life of St. Christopher have to do with Judith, not Judas? And some think, and I'm definitely in this group, that the manuscript was put together. It's actually 2 manuscripts that were put together into one. Okay? The Noel Codex is the overall, and then part of it's called the Townley manuscript, and I can't remember what the other one is. That the whole thing taken together is maybe a Liber Monstrorum, a book of monsters. Now there is an actual book called the Liber Monstrorum, which is a book of monsters. It's about monstrous things, monstrous creatures, etc. So how is this a book of monsters? Well, In The Wonders of the East, which is about a guy's travels to the east, Syria, modern day Syria and Turkey, really, maybe a little bit of Iraq and such, and it's all the strange things he sees. People, for example, with their heads in the middle of their chests. So faces here, okay? People with only one leg, probably where C.S. Lewis gets the duffel puds in Voyage of the Dawn Treader from. People hopping around. People with heads of dogs and bodies of humans, like St. Christopher. St. Christopher was apparently a dog-headed person until he was converted. He was also a giant. Most St. Christopher medals have St. Christopher with Jesus on his shoulder because he's carrying Jesus over or the Christ child, over a river. Okay? Letter of Alexander to Aristotle. Supposedly, nobody thinks this is real by any means. Supposedly written by Alexander during his travels to India, back to his teacher about all the wonderful things I'm seeing. And they're monstrous. Okay? They're human with other things added to them or changed. Okay? Life of St. Christopher, dog-headed man who becomes regular-headed man, kind of monstrous. Beowulf, Dragon, Grendel. Beowulf himself is very monstrous. And then Judith. I mean, how more monstrous can you get than a woman who kills a man? I mean, up against the whole sacred order there, okay? Old Testament story. This is, okay? So a lot of people see that, take that back, not a lot. A few Beowulf scholars see that it's kind of a book of monsters, right? So, Robert Bruce Cotton, he owned a whole bunch of these. Come back to this for a minute. Why is it called Cotton Vitellius A15? Why in the world would you name your book Vitellius?
This is the statue guy.
Yeah. So, think of this room and, no, don't, you can't. As Robert Bruce Cotton's library, because it would have been lined with oak or mahogany or walnut, paneling. And he had in his library bookcases. And each bookcase had on the top the bust of a Roman emperor. Okay? And I think they were arranged chronologically by emperor. I have no idea. I've never actually looked it up when Vitellius was an emperor. He's not one of those names that really sticks out. Okay? So, on the bookcase that had the bust of the Roman emperor Vitellius on it, you go down to A, the first shelf, A, B, C, D, etc., and the 15th item in. And that's where this manuscript goes. Later on, we're going to get to Sir Gawain the Green Knight. Cotton, Nero, A10. Find the bust of Nero, first shelf, 10th item in. It's a pretty good classification system. Okay? In my opinion, a hell of a lot better than John Dewey's. MTSU finally entered the real world, 5 years ago, and went to the Library of Congress classification. Drove me crazy when I first started here. Okay? So that's how he arranged his manuscripts. When he dies in 1631, I think it is, he donates his entire collection to the British Library. Okay? Everything. But it's donated, but it's not moved to the British Library. It's still in his house. It's called Ashburnham House. Ashburnham has nothing to do with the fire. It sounds like Ashburnham, There's a fire at Ashburnham House in 1731 in the library. This is another place where some of those works of medieval literature were destroyed. And according to the story, when people discovered the fire, they ran up to the library and they literally, because the house overlooked the Thames, they literally broke out a window and would grab manuscripts and throw them out the window. Some of them went in the Thames and washed away. Some of them landed down below. Beowulf is one of the manuscripts that was burned. If you look at this page, Okay? Notice this margin is like this margin. It's in what is called the gutter of the book. Okay? If the book is closed tightly, like this, you can literally take a blowtorch to this part, the binding, it's not going to burn. Why? Basic physics. There's no oxygen. There's no, fire's got to have oxygen to burn. There's no oxygen there. But out here, yeah, it's going to get a little charred. So, out here and at the top, it's charred. What you see around it is this frame that the librarians at the British Library put around it. Each leaf of the manuscript has this page, has this frame around it to keep it intact, okay? So it was partially burned. And because it was partially burned, parts of it are missing. Letters, a few words, etc. Okay? So that happened in 1731. Other comments about the Beowulf manuscript. It generally dates from the same time as all those others that we've talked about, 975 to 1025, though we're going to talk about this. It possibly, the manuscript itself, could possibly date from later, okay, which we'll go over. Now, what does the story of Beowulf tell us? What's it ultimately about? In the manuscript, it isn't titled Beowulf. You've got the beginning of the poem right there. What way Gardena? It's no Beowulf story at the top, all right? Well, it tells a story about a guy who's a monster killer, okay? Beowulf the Geat. And he comes to the land of the Danes. He solves their Grendel problem. Think of him as the monster exterminator. He solves their Grendel problem. He goes back home. He eventually becomes king. And he has to fight a dragon. And he dies in fighting the dragon. J.R.R. Tolkien, in his essay, which is, you got a link to a PDF, and I think you actually have the PDF itself on the content section of the D2L. In his essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, that he delivered in 1936 to the British Academy, Tolkien did something regarding Beowulf that really nobody before him had ever done. It's mind-blowing, okay? He read the poem as a poem. He read it as a work of literary art, rather than what nearly every critic prior to him had done. And that is, they read Beowulf as a mine to be delved, to get what they could out of the mine about Germanic customs and practices and beliefs and material culture, swords, mail shirts, flagons, ships. In other words, they read it as almost like a source of archaeological material. They didn't read it as a work of literary art. And Tolkien said, it's a work of literary art. And it's a whole, it's unified, it's complete. And it's a work of singular literary art. Okay? By which he meant pretty much one author. Now, that author might have worked some things in that weren't native to him, but pretty much one author, okay? And he said, ultimately, it tells us a very simple story. It's about the rise and fall of a hero. That's it. We see Beowulf's rise, we see him at the top, and we see his fall. And if you read it simply in that sense, without it being performed, it's kind of like a tragedy. Tolkien didn't say that, I'm saying that. Rise and fall, that's typical tragic structure, okay? But there's a lot more to it than that. Because, again, prior to Tolkien, everybody took the references to the monsters. Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon as being peripheral to the poem. Why? It's not a trick question, it's not a rocket science question. Why would Grendel be read as peripheral to the poem?
Because they weren't interested in the story, they were just interested in the
Okay.
historical aspect.
Keep going, because Grendel is not real. Bingo. He's not real. He's not historical. Why? Because we all know there are no monsters in the world. We all know there aren't dragons. Therefore, the dragon is unimportant. That's pretty much it. If that's going to be your approach to literature, what do you do with most I'll go back a little bit, pre-1800 literature? I mean, we all know crosses don't talk. Yeah. So why read it? We all know there are no gods, so why read the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are as much about the gods as they are about the Trojan War and Odysseus' journey home. We all know Excalibur isn't real, and Merlin couldn't have really been, the son of the devil, etc. So why read? Okay, that's part of Tolkien's point. It's all part of story. Story is important. Okay, so how we read Beowulf partially is dependent upon, I'm trying to think how to put this, how we interpret Beowulf is dependent upon what assumptions we make about the poem. Okay? All of us make assumptions about the stuff we read. Somebody tells you, oh man, this is a great book. You've not read it before. You've never read the author before. And so, in your mind, you now have a preconception of what the other person has said. So you approach it thinking, damn, that's a big, thick sucker of Shakespeare. Mine's like half that size. There's not more Shakespeare plays that have been discovered. Sorry, just looking at that thinking, that's not like a coffee table book, that's like a build a house on cornerstone. Shakespeare, as an example. We have preconceptions. We have assumptions. Okay? But then when you go and read what Shakespeare really wrote as opposed to what somebody said about what he wrote, what should happen to those preconceptions? Hopefully they're not reinforced. Hopefully they're blown out of the water. Okay? Here's a couple of preconceptions. A lot of scholars approach Beowulf with the idea that the story is ultimately really old. Well, from our point of view, it is really old, right? But they're talking about from the point of view of, let's say, when it was written in the manuscript, that at that time, the story was itself really, really old. Well, there's a good reason for that preconception or that assumption. When is the story set? It's literally set sometime around, slightly before and shortly following the year 520. Why 520? Why not 525? Because this is the date that we can actually date something that occurs in the poem. There's an event in the poem that is historical, okay? And that's the death of Hygelac, or Hygelac, Hygelac, okay? Beowulf's uncle. He was real. This character is real. He actually died in a raid against the Frisians. It is recounted in several texts. All right? So, the world of the poem is sometimes shortly before and shortly after this event. Okay? It goes at least 50 years after this event. Because Helek dies, his son becomes king. We're not told how long he's king. And then Beowulf becomes king, and Beowulf rules for 50 years. So it could go as late as 600, if you want. So that's, dateable portion. Oh, so then the poem, it's kind of assumed at first, could go back as far as then. Okay? So you have this, what's called the dating question of the poem. When is the poem originally composed? Is it old, pre-800? And I just kind of chose this number. A lot of people would say, you should probably make that more like pre-700. I mean, there are some who think the poem could date in its earliest form from sometime in the 7th century, okay? The late date is post 900, okay? And some would say, no, that's too early. It needs to be much later than that. For example, I'll give you one. Used to be professor at University of Louisville. Take that back, University of Kentucky at Louisville. Kevin Kiernan wrote in a book published in the early 80s, then republished, started as an article, then as a book, then republished, that the Beowulf that we have in the manuscript now is really the only Beowulf in the form that we have it now that ever existed. That is, prior to its being written in the manuscript that we have now, what we read as Beowulf never existed. Okay? A different form of Beowulf existed in primarily 2 different stories. Story about Beowulf and his fight with Grendel and Grendel's mother. One story. In other words, Beowulf in his youth, and then the story about Beowulf and his fight against the dragon. Beowulf in his old age. Okay? Kieran has this long, complex argument, and I, for the most part, agree with him. Not the majority of Old English scholars agree with this. In fact, I would say the majority pretty much are against it. But I think he makes a very compelling case. Because there's a portion in the manuscript where the manuscript finishes with Beowulf and the Grendel's story. In the beginning of the dragon story, there's a sheet, a page, that's been entirely scrubbed clean and something else written over it. And that's where Kiernan argues, where the poet was going to say something, changes his mind, scratches it, and links together these 2 separate stories. And one of the reasons he does that is because there's information on, I don't want to go into all that. Too much information. So, Kiernan argues for a late date. He argues actually for a date sometime in Canute's reign, 1016 to 1035. Okay? Now, take either of these dates and this date. So let's take 700 versus, let's go even later. Let's say 1000. Okay? What's happening in England between 700 and 1000 AD? What begins less than 100 years after this? Whose? No.
Right.
Viking invasions. Viking invasions begin 793. They go on for the next 200 years. I know there's a little bit of peace every now and then. Alfred gets 20 years of peace. His son gets a few years of peace. And then they start up again. You've got the Dane law where the Vikings, have started settling and living, etc. But they're still hitting. I mean, you have the Battle of Malden in 991. That's a Viking invasion. If Canute and Svein Forkbeard, 1014, that's a Viking invasion. Okay? What the hell do the Viking invasions have to do with Beowulf? Who is the story about? Danes? Swedes? These are Vikings. These are the progenitors of the Vikings. Okay? Are you going to write, let's say you're an Iraqi poet, and you're writing in 2005. Are you going to write a poem extolling the virtues of America? More than likely not. Why? Because America still, whatever your politics, doesn't matter. Because America at that point is occupying your land. They might be doing it for noble reasons, they might not. It doesn't matter. They're occupying your land. Okay? You're an Anglo-Saxon, okay, living 900 AD. And the Vikings have been ravaging your land for 200 years, essentially, 100 plus years. Are you going to write a poem celebrating the ancestors of the Vikings? Not likely. Similarly, if the poem was written back here, 700 or so, and we're pretty sure it got copied every now and then. Why? Because there's many different dialects preserved in Beowulf. It looks like a form of the story, probably if you were looking, I'm a map, and you're looking towards me, up here in the north of England, and then it just kind of generally travels and does this. Almost makes like a J, okay? And it picks up Northumbrian dialect, East Anglian dialect, Southern dialect, Wessex dialect, and Mercian dialect. Little elements, like pieces of it, are being copied in a scriptorium here and here and here, or the whole thing travels. Thing is, there's no real concrete proof because we don't have any aspect of the story of Beowulf survive anywhere else. None. Nothing. Zip. Nada. Zip. There's not even the name, except for in a couple of charters. Beowulf's Hammer. Beowulf's home. Grendel's Mere. Grendel's pool. Okay? That's it. All right? Other than Helak, who's real. All the other references, they're Old Norse. They're Old Norse mythology, they're Old Norse things like that. So, if the poem dates from here or earlier, how do you account for, it surviving through the Viking invasions and the people generally not liking anything to do with the Vikings? Why would they keep copying it? It's part of the argument for a late date, etc. Okay? Why is this important? If the poem's early, then you have to say all the Christian stuff in it is probably stuff that's been added. In other words, the poem was originally pagan. Good Germanic pagan, slaughter, kill, steal, rape, pillage, etc. Okay? If it's later, then the so-called Christian elements aren't elements. They are interwoven part and parcel, part of the poem from the poet's mind at the beginning. two hugely different assumptions. Okay? And this is my reading of it. I'm going to emphasize, it's pretty clear to me, there's no way the Christianity is tacked on. And I'm going to probably spend way too much time talking about a 7 or 8 line passage that J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the greatest Beowulf scholars who ever lived, okay, argues wasn't original to the poem. And I'm going to say, Tollers, you're crazy. It's as central to the poem as Beowulf is to the poem. And I think he was blinded by his assumptions. Okay? The reason I mentioned J.R.R. Tolkien, The Monsters and the Critics, and what I said about Tolkien's the first one to think of it as a poem, etc., etc. Anybody who has written anything about Beowulf after Tolkien delivered that essay, you have to cite Tolkien. You have to at least bow to the master before you go on with your own idea. I mean, everybody who's written anything has got to deal with what Tolkien said. He's that important for Beowulf studies. Okay? So, with all that said, and probably not very clearly or understandable, the poem begins, what? Like we saw with Dream of the Rood. If you get interested in Beowulf, I highly encourage Roy Lewis's Facing Page translation, 2nd edition, just Beowulf, Broadside Press. It's not Broadview Press. This, when it first came out, was not much. It was like 10 or 11 bucks. Okay, but it's a great edition. When I used to teach graduate level course, I would tell students, get this. Don't cheat from it when you do your own translations, but get it because the notes and all that kind of stuff are just fantastic. What? We gardena in jargagum fed kinninga thrim jefrunan. Huth arthalingas ellen fremadon. So, we have heard of the glory in bygone days of the folk kings of the Spear Danes, how those noble lords did lofty deeds. Notice the tense, the verb tense, used throughout. We have heard, past, bygone days, did lofty. When are we talking about? Long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. In other words, how do fairy tales begin? Once upon a time. The poet, the singer, if you want, is taking us mentally back in time. Okay? One of the reasons for that may be we don't have people today doing these glorious deeds. Think of what the seafarer says. We live in worse times. We don't have Caesars and kings like we used to. Okay? So, we've heard of the glory of the folk kings of the Spear Danes. How they did lofty deeds. Often shield shoving seized the mead benches from many tribes. Troops of enemies struck furrow into eels. Man. I almost did it again. Struck fear into earls. I should just go home now. What does that mean? And notice you've got the gloss. Gloss is about Spear Danes and shield shoving. Shield, son of Shafe, meaning shield, son of sheaf, i.e. of grain. And there's been all kinds of stuff about the, fertility gods and goddesses, etc., etc. You can read this anthropologically. You can read it, agriculturally, so to speak. Believe me, the poem's been read, interpreted so many different ways. What I'm interested in is, what does he mean by seized? He seized the mead benches from many tribes, troops of enemies, struck fear into earls. The Old English Oft schuldscheving, schaden athratum, monigomaitum, merosetla oftea. Okay? The merosetla oftea is what Liuza translates, seized the mead benches. Medo, mead, setla. Anybody familiar with early American furniture making? Settle, S-E-T-T-L-E. It's a piece of wooden furniture that you sit on, or a settee, same kind of thing, okay? It's a bench, essentially, but a settle and a settee have a back that you can lean against. These benches didn't, okay? Oftea. It does mean seized. I mean, that is one of the literal translations of it, okay? What else? What does it really mean, though? I mean, is this describing Schildscheving marches into your hall? My bench. No. What's it mean? He took possession of the hall. What happened to the people who used the hall? Okay? Struck fear into earls. In other words, let's use a modern English word to describe Schildscheving. He's a what? If he struck fear into people, he terrorized them. Okay? Though he first was found a waif. He awaited solace for that. What's a waif? Not a word we use very often.
Somebody who's lost.
Kind of. Orphan? Why not use orphan? Everybody knows what the word orphan means. Waif? You got to go back at least 100 years before you see that word very often used. Okay? So, he was found, notice, an orphan. A wandering, lost child, if you want. He awaited solace for that. The word for solace there is frovra, if I remember correctly. Line 7. Yep. And the verb, yabad, related to yabidan. He awaited, experienced, longed for, expected. Okay? How you translate, again, affects. So, he grew under heaven, prospered in honor, until every one of the encircling nations, over the whales riding the ocean, had to obey him, grant him tribute. All right? So what's that telling us? Powerful. What else? How powerful?
Very powerful.
He had all the neighboring tribes across the ocean from where he was. Okay, we're not talking like, he's on the coast of Ireland and the people in Newfoundland are paying him tribute. We're talking get the right ocean. The ocean, Baltic Sea. Northern Germany, Sweden and Norway come down, okay? So that area. And you have Denmark sticking up, and you have the islands off the coast of Denmark, between Denmark and modern day, between Denmark and Sweden. He's in that area. He's on one of those islands, probably. Okay? The surrounding peoples are the peoples on the coasts of those surrounding lands. How fearful is he? They pay him tribute. For what? What's a modern idea for tribute? Okay, keep going.
Taxes.
No, not taxes. Think mafia. Protection money. You pay us, and nothing bad will happen to you. Now, it's not promising nothing bad by his neighbors will happen to him, but nothing bad from me. Like, you'll get to keep your kneecaps if you pay me. Okay? And then we get the first of 3 instances in the poem where we have fat was God king. That was good king. That was a good king. What makes him a good king? What have we just been told?
He scared people.
He scared the living daylights out of his enemies. He defeated his enemies. He took their halls. By doing so, what does he do for his kingdom? It protects it and it enlarges it. Okay? So he enlarges his kingdom, he defeats his enemies, and he gets his enemies to pay him tribute. Oh, that's a good king. That's the kind of king you want. Okay? Think early date, late date. If the poem's written late, 900,000 AD, and your land is being ravaged by Vikings, the descendants of this kind of guy, and you say, oh man, look what he did. He defeated his enemies, he expanded the kingdom, and he got them to pay tribute. Oh, that was a good king. Come on, step up. Okay, you see how the late date can affect the interpretation? Because if it is, then this could be a poet kind of urging on some kind of, state action, so to speak. Come on, Lord, act. Defend your people. Protect them. Not Lord of the hall, of the country. Okay? A boy was later born to him, young in the courts, whom, notice, God sent. I'm pretty sure that is also. Yep, it is God. It's not metod or shipping. It's G-O-D. Whom God sent as, again, a comfort to the people. So we were told, Shield-Shoving awaited, his translation, comfort for having been a waif, an orphan. Okay? And then we're told he has a child, and the child is a comfort to the people. Okay? He saw their need. Who's the he there in that line 14? It's not capitalized, but it's probably still God. God saw their need. And so what does he do? He sends them a comforter. What does Jesus say shortly before he dies? When I go, I will send you a comforter. That's the Holy Spirit. I'm not equating, don't get me wrong, I'm not equating Shield's son with the Holy Spirit. He saw their need, the dire distress they had endured, lordless for such a long time. I think that's implying that possibly Shield's son wasn't direct. This is son, like in the Old Testament biblical sense of son, who can be like a grandson or great-grandson or great-great. Still a son of, okay? Otherwise, why would they be full of distress? What would they have endured lordless? I mean, if Shield was direct lineal father to the son, unless he died shortly thereafter and the son had to be raised. The Lord of life, wielder of glory, gave him worldly honor. Beowulf, the son of Shield, was... This is not the Beowulf the poem is named for. All right? The son of Shield was renowned. His fame spread wide in Scandinavian lands. Look at your footnote. Not the monster-slaying hero of the title, but an early Danish king. Many scholars argue that the original name was Baal. The manuscript does not read Baal. It reads Beowulf. All right? Some editors amend it. They change the wording so that it reads B-E-O-W, so that readers don't get confused with the later Beowulf. Okay? The Lord of life, wielder of glory, that's God, gave him worldly honor. Beowulf, the son of Scyld, was renowned. His fame spread wide in Scandinavian lands. And then we get a little proverbial phrase, a gnome, a proverb. Thus should a man bring about good with pious gifts from his father's possessions, so that later in life loyal comrades will stand beside him when war comes. The people will support him. With praiseworthy deeds, a man will prosper among any people. Okay? Now, an interesting thing about the poem is that this little passage that I just discussed, that I said kind of is a proverb or gnomic passage, that can apply to the monster killing Beowulf later on in the poem. In fact, at the end of the poem. Because what are we told here? A young man should bring about good. That is, should do something that results in a good. How? By bestowing pious gifts from his father's possession. Why? So that later in life, when he's old, what? Loyal comrades will stand beside him when war comes. How many of you have read Beowulf before? High school, something like that. Only a few of you. Okay, I'm going to give away something. It doesn't matter. Towards the end of the poem, Beowulf's fighting the dragon. He's fighting the dragon by himself. He ordered his men, this is only for me to do, you stay over here. Most of them are like, thank you, Jesus, we don't want to fight a dragon. Okay? Beowulf's losing that battle. And one of his men says, no, I got to go in there, disobey my lord, go in there and help him. And he goes in and helps them. Together they kill the dragon. But Beowulf receives a fatal bite, and he dies shortly thereafter. Okay? The guy who helps him after he's dead then delivers a diatribe against the men who wouldn't stand with Beowulf. And he says, all the armor, all the weapons, all the stuff he gave you served him no purpose. What does the speaker say here? He's essentially saying, buy yourself friends who will stick with you later in life. Well, Beowulf bought himself friends, but they didn't stick with him. Now, I think there's something going on there that the poet is suggesting about buying friends, the Germanic culture, the whole hero system, so to speak. Okay? So, line 26, Scyld dies at his appointed time. Notice, the mighty Lord went into the Lord's keeping. They bore him down to the brimming sea, his dear comrades. Okay? They put him in a boat. They load the boat with treasure, and what do? You've all seen this in one film or another. They give him a great Viking burial. They send him out to the ocean. Some guy stands up on the promontory. It's implied. It's not in here. Okay? But some guy in all these film versions stands up on the promontory, tips an arrow in burning tar, pulls it way back, and it's a postage stamp 800 yards away. And it hits it, and flames burst, and he's dead. Notice we're told he does what? He goes where no one knows, just like he came from, where no one knows. And we have a nice little envelope pattern for Scyld Cheving. He came seemingly from God, and he went seemingly to God. Okay? No one knows, men do not know how to say truly, not trust the counselors, nor heroes under the heavens who received that cargo. Okay, we'll stop there. Today's Tuesday. Thursday, I'm going to back up for just a moment, lines 40 and following, and I'm going to relate those to an archaeological discovery in the 1930s called Sutton Hoo. Okay? And then we'll pick up with the first part. Then Beowulf, Scylding, Beloved King, etc. All right, have a good day.